Hi everyone, welcome to OCD Workshop 2. So Workshop 2 is focusing on how to overcome OCD now. So we've looked at what OCD is and what it involves. We now need to learn or start to get to know the idea of how we overcome it. So in today's session, part 1 is going to be recapping what we went through in Workshop 1. We went through a huge amount of information. I asked you to reflect on a huge amount of different elements, and so it's going to be really important to remind ourselves of that. It also helps us to, I suppose, know where we're at when it comes to the change method as well. If we know how OCD works, the change method makes that bit more sense as to why we do what we do with cognitive behavioural therapy. Part 2 will then focus on exposure and response prevention, or ERP, which is the cognitive behavioural therapy technique that we use to support OCD. So we'll explain a lot more about the treatment itself, what it involves, and how we support you within the service. Let's start with part 1 then, start at the beginning once again and recap from Workshop 1. So first of all, what we already know is that OCD occurs when we become overly concerned about our intrusive thoughts. So when an intrusive thought comes into our minds, but we're overly concerned with it, we give it importance. So we think that that intrusive thought is important and therefore we should respond to it. We should do something about it. Something bad will happen. It says something bad about us, about our values. It goes against our values or how we see ourselves as a person. Often something to do with harm, either coming to ourselves or others. So we really see it as something that if we were to ignore, something bad would happen. So we're really concerned about that intrusive thought. And remember last time I also talked about the amount of responsibility that we place on ourselves to deal with it as well. It's my responsibility. It will be my fault if I don't focus on this thought, or that bad thing will happen because of me if I don't focus on it. Second, compulsions usually help to reduce the unpleasant emotions that are triggered by those intrusive thoughts. So when we have an intrusive thought, we have the unpleasant emotions that go with it, and so we develop compulsions to help us feel better. It helps us to relieve some of that anxiety or that pain that we may feel, for example. But what we also know is that it does reduce them. We're not discounting that, but it reduces them in the short term. So it's making us feel better in the short term, but in the long term, it's keeping the cycle going. Because compulsions and avoidance stop us or limit our ability to learn the truth about the intrusive thoughts. So they don't help us to learn that the thought isn't important, that it's not likely to come true, that we don't need to respond to it. Compulsions and avoidance stop us from learning that. It also limits our ability to realise that we're more able to cope with that anxiety or that shame than we give ourselves credit for. So really important to remember that although compulsions do reduce unpleasant feelings in the short term, in the long term, it's keeping the cycle going. So let's remind ourselves of the cycle itself. So we have the trigger or a situation which leads to an intrusive thought, image, or urge. Remember, the intrusive thoughts can be images, they can be almost like videos, thoughts, different ways that they present themselves in our minds, but all in all, they're intrusive. And the element that separates us from everybody else that has these intrusive thoughts is that people experiencing OCD give important meaning to that intrusive thought. It's important. I need to focus on this. I need to give it attention and I need to do something about it. Because we give it such meaning, because they're not normally very nice intrusive thoughts. If we had positive or nice intrusive thoughts, we wouldn't really think anything of it. But because they're often not very nice, it triggers unpleasant emotions. Anxiety, disgust, fear, shame, embarrassment. And as a result, because it causes that unpleasant feeling, we have an urge to stop the thought from coming true. I must relieve this unpleasant feeling and I must make sure that this thought doesn't come true. What we do is we introduce a behaviour. We introduce a compulsion to stop the thoughts or feelings happening. What that does is give us a temporary relief from those unpleasant feelings. So, for example, if I were to check repeatedly, that helps me to relieve some of my anxiety. It then becomes a compulsion because I feel that's the only thing I can do in order to reduce my anxiety. I might also avoid triggers. It's very true, you know, there's no discounting this, but well, if I avoid the trigger, I'm less likely to have an intrusive thought. Problem solved? Not, but that's how we interpret it. So both using compulsions and avoidance, we learn that action, that avoidance brings temporary relief. So we continue to do it. We keep going with that. We don't challenge, we don't question, we just keep doing those behaviours because we know that brings us some sense of relief for the short term. It doesn't stop the intrusive thoughts from happening in the future, but does relieve some of that anxiety or whatever emotion it is we're feeling. What those behaviours also do is stop me from finding out that potentially the meaning of that thought, the likelihood of it happening, isn't as accurate, isn't as true as maybe compared to what maybe I think. So I really think that that intrusive thought is definitely going to come true, and that compulsion is the only way that I can stop it from coming true. And in fact, there may be alternatives to that belief. But because we have the compulsions, because we have the avoidance, I don't question that. And I'm not able to see any of those other examples or possibilities that are outside of that blinker that I have on currently. As I avoid triggers, it feeds back into the cycle. The more I avoid, the more the anxiety remains, but also potentially with avoidance, the bracket for what I need to avoid can grow over time. So it might have for you initially started with avoiding going out at a certain time, going out at peak times, whereas now you don't go out at all. So slowly but surely our avoidance does grow. We're also looking out for triggers. Because we don't want to experience that unpleasant feeling, our bodies are, I suppose, developed to look out for threats, because actually, well, if I can look out for them, I'm more prepared. But in this case, when we're hypervigilant for any particular trigger, we're just more likely to find it. If I'm more concerned about something going on in my body, if I'm hyper aware of what's going on in my body, I'm more likely to notice the slightest change, the slightest symptom. So actually, the more aware we are of our triggers, the more likely we are to trigger that intrusive thought. And so all of these elements are keeping the OCD going and actually keeping it or increasing the likelihood of triggering an intrusive thought. Not consciously, obviously not intentionally, but that is what happens. And that's why it becomes so overwhelming. It takes over our daily lives, and it can really just stop us from doing anything that we want to do or being able to enjoy anything anymore. So let's look at a couple of examples. These will be similar to or the same as what we looked at last week, but just to remind ourselves. So we've got the trigger, intrusive image of germs on hands. This thought is true and I'll become ill. So because I've had an intrusive image of germs being on my hands, I automatically think that that thought is true, it's going to happen, and I'm going to become ill. But I need to make sure that I really focus on this thought, otherwise I am going to become ill. So it's important, it's a value to me to focus on. I then may start looking out for germs. So I'm going to then be hyper aware for it, increasing the likelihood of that cycle happening of creating a trigger, intrusive images. Feel anxious and disgusted because I'm going to become ill if I don't deal with this. I want to get rid of the germs naturally, because if I think I'm going to become ill, then I want to do something to avoid that. So what I do is I wash my hands for 30 minutes. That is my compulsion. That is the rule that I've set myself as well. If I wash my hands for 30 minutes, I think that's a good enough amount of time to remove the germs from my hands. That allows me to relieve some of my anxiety, some of my disgust. because I've learned it's a compulsion, it's a behavior that gives me some sort of reward. We know that washing our hands helps us to keep safe and to not be and to be less likely to become ill. So that's what I'm going to do. Every time I have that intrusive thought, I'm going to wash my hands for 30 seconds. That helps me to feel, oh, okay, I feel calm now. I feel less anxious. Because I know that that is the case, I'm going to keep doing it. I'm also going to avoid touching objects. So what can often happen is we all often start with the washing of the hands, the compulsive behavior. We then develop the avoidance with time. But I'm going to avoid touching objects because if I avoid touching objects, then I'm far less likely to have germs on my hands, far less likely to then have that intrusive image again, and therefore I can feel some relief. There's less likelihood of me having a trigger for that particular thought that comes in and that causes me such anxiety. If I avoid touching objects, less likely to have germs, less likely to become ill. That's helpful, thank you. Yep, that relieves some of my anxiety. The more I avoid, the more triggers there are. The more objects I'm not allowed to touch, the more likelihood that I'm going to touch something eventually and that I'm going to trigger that intrusive thought. It widens it, keeps it going. And also I learned that washing or avoiding touching objects helps me to feel better in the short term. So I carry on. And what I believe is that I didn't become ill because of this compulsion, because I avoided touching objects. So it strengthens the truth of my belief in that initial thought of this thought is true and I'll become it. Don't question the fact that actually I might not have become ill even if I didn't wash my hands, even if I didn't avoid touching objects. Don't question how important that thought really is. And I also don't question my ability to deal with that anxiety on my own without the compulsion or the avoidance. So ultimately, my anxiety will always be the same level every time that intrusive image comes in. I can relieve it to a small amount and for short term, but it will always be the same whenever I have that intrusive image because I'm not challenging it in a way that challenges the belief at the very beginning. Example 2, an intrusive image of a naked child. So I have the intrusive thought. I then think I need to control my thoughts. I should control them. I feel ashamed of myself for the thought I had. I therefore want to get rid of these thoughts. So I try to push the thoughts out of my head. Remember, sometimes these compulsions are physical actions, washing hands, for example. Sometimes they're mental activities, counting, replaying a conversation, trying to push it to the back of our minds. If I do that, I feel less ashamed. I also avoid being near children to make sure that I am definitely no risk to anyone. And therefore, I've learned that pushing the thoughts away and avoiding children helps me to feel better in the short term. But what I don't learn is that if I hadn't tried to push the thoughts away, I'd have felt more and more ashamed. That's my belief. So I don't challenge that thought. I'm also looking out for inappropriate thoughts. So now I'm really hypervigilant of how I'm thinking. So I'm more likely to trigger that intrusive image. And because I'm avoiding being near children, that widens the different situations, the different circumstances and environments that trigger is more likely to lead to that intrusive image. I'm keeping the cycle going. So far, we've looked at that obsession, the compulsion and the avoidance. So remember that pie chart that we looked at in workshop 1. The added element to this, or for some at least, is other people. Friends, family, colleagues, it can be a variety of people that also feed into this cycle and keep the OCD going that we need to be aware of. As I said before, they're not doing it intentionally, they're doing it to support us, but they are part of the maintenance. And so we need to be aware of where other people are involved, again, to make a change to it. So if we have that trigger, we have the intrusive image or the urge, important meanings to give to my intrusive thoughts. So it's valuable, I need to focus on it. Looking out for triggers, so I'm more likely to trigger that intrusive thought. Unpleasant feelings, an urge to stop the thought from coming true. So I involve other people to try and stop the intrusive thought. seek reassurance, I ask for help. That offers me temporary relief from those unpleasant feelings. I also ask other people to help me avoid the triggers. So we might ask them to do things for us, go certain places so we don't have to. And that avoidance then grows. What is likely to happen is that the more situations we ask other people to do for us, the more situations that will develop into. So slowly but surely lose our confidence, put it all in someone else. They can deal with it. They're reassuring. They are the only person that can help me to relieve my anxiety. I can't do it on my own. I need those people. So therefore, other people helping helps me feel better in the short term. That then stops me finding out if these meanings are accurate or true. So it stops me, if I'm asking other people to help me, it first of all stops me from believing in myself. It stops me from realizing that potentially that intrusive thought, the importance I'm giving it, isn't going to come true. It's not an important thought to focus on. And I also only put faith in others. I can't stop my anxiety, other people can. In the short term, yes, they offer relief, but in the long term, every time I'm triggered, every time that intrusive thought comes up, it's still just as anxiety provoking, if not more so. Examples with the germs on hands, we might ask my son, for example, to clean the kitchen thoroughly. Ask my son to do the washing and all the cleaning so that I don't do it. Therefore, less responsibility on me, less likely to lead to a trigger. Well, if I'm not doing it, then I'm not going to worry so much of having germs on my hands and becoming. Also, I learned that my son cleaning and washing helps me to feel better. It relieves that anxiety in the short term. So I'm going to keep doing it. I repeat those things that I ask them to do. And actually, over time, those jobs, for example, cleaning the kitchen, those kind of things, or the way that we need them to clean becomes their automatic behavior as well. So they might not even realize that they're doing it anymore, but it started from you asking them to do it as part of the OCD. That stops me finding out if my thoughts are true and important, keeps the anxiety going. Intrusive image of naked child. So I should control my thoughts. I feel ashamed. My mum gives me reassurance. So I ask someone else to reassure me that it's okay or that I haven't done something to harm someone. I then feel less ashamed. I have confidence in their belief. They're saying they don't have any mental health difficulties, so I can trust those. I can trust them with their judgment. Me, I don't feel like I'm trustworthy. I don't have any confidence in myself. My mum does all the shopping, so I don't need to leave home. So we don't even leave the house anymore. I'm not going to come in contact with any children if I don't leave the house, so I'll get someone else to do all the other stuff outside of my home for me. So I'm learning that seeking reassurance, avoiding leaving the home helps me to feel better in the short term. And then we believe that if I hadn't got reassurance, I would have felt more and more ashamed. If my mum hadn't have reassured me, I would have just continued to feel more and more ashamed. I wouldn't have been able to cope. It would have been too much. We don't question that. We've got this compulsion to ask for help or reassurance. We've got this avoidance. I'm not questioning that belief that that thought is even true. Should we control every thought? Can we control every thought that we have? But also, I recognise I am not capable to battle this or to manage these feelings of ashamed. Okay, so that's a recap. I hope that's still making sense for everybody. I hope that's been helpful just to remind ourselves, refresh ourselves of the maintenance cycle, the elements of obsessions, compulsions, avoidance, and other people. It's so important to recognise all of those working together to keep the OCD going, because that's how we need to focus on it when we start to look at change. Take some time now, have a pause, and then we'll come back in part 2 to look at ERP, which is the cognitive behavioural therapy technique that we will use to support you in making a change. I'll see you back in part 2.